A Blazing Reckoning. New York, 1922. Margaret Calloway had packed away James Calloway's uniform after his funeral. But as she cleaned the attic, she found it laid out neatly on an old chair, pressed and clean, as if someone had just worn it. And in the breast pocket his wedding vows, written in his own hand. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Silk and Wool. The attic air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of mothballs and forgotten summers. Margaret Calloway coughed, a dry, papery sound that echoed in the cavernous space. Sunlight sliced through cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced like tiny, restless spirits. She hadn't been up here in months, not since she'd packed away the last of James's things. 4 years. 4 years since the telegram, the folded flag, the hollow ache in her chest that had never truly faded. She'd come today with a purpose, to finally clear out the remnants of their life together. To sell the house, perhaps. To move on. But the task felt monumental, each box and trunk a landmine of memories. She ran a gloved hand along the smooth, cool surface of a cedar chest, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. It had been a wedding gift from James's mother. "Too grand for us, Maggie," he'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, "but Mother insists." Margaret sighed, the sound catching in her throat. She had to be strong. Practical. James wouldn't want her to wallow. He'd always been the pragmatic one, the anchor to her sometimes turbulent emotions. "Steady on, Maggie," he'd say, his voice a low rumble in her ear, his hand warm on her back. She moved deeper into the attic, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the wooden floorboards. But the dust motes swirled faster, the shadows deepening in the corners of the room. Margaret clutched the vows to her chest, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't just grief playing tricks. Something else was going on. Something inexplicable. And she was suddenly, terrifyingly, certain that James's death wasn't the simple, tragic story she'd been told. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Attic Dust. The attic silence pressed in on Margaret, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She reread the vows, each word a sharp, poignant stab. "Look for me in the quiet moments." What did that mean? Was it simply a romantic sentiment, a husband's attempt to comfort his grieving wife from beyond the grave? Or was it something more a literal instruction? She glanced around the attic, her eyes scanning the shadows, the piles of forgotten belongings. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. She felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. "James?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The sound was swallowed by the stillness. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She was being ridiculous. She was letting grief and the strangeness of the situation get the better of her. But the uniform, the vows, they couldn't be ignored. Margaret decided to examine the uniform more closely. She picked up the jacket, the heavy wool feeling strangely warm in her hands. She ran her fingers over the brass buttons, each one polished to a high shine. She checked the pockets one by one. The breast pocket, where she'd found the vise, was empty now. The other pockets were also empty, except for a small, almost imperceptible bulge in the lining of the inside pocket. She carefully felt along the seam, her fingers detecting a small, hard object concealed within the lining. It was rectangular, about the size of a matchbox. With a growing sense of anticipation, she reached for a small pair of sewing scissors she'd found in a nearby basket. She carefully snipped a few threads, creating a small opening in the lining. She reached inside and pulled out the object. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and faded. The leather was soft, almost velvety to the touch. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling. The first few pages were blank. Then, she found an entry, written in James's familiar handwriting. It was dated July 1st, 1918, just a few months before he died. "The mission is more dangerous than I anticipated. The whispers are true. There is a traitor in our midst. Someone is feeding information to the enemy. I don't know who to trust." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A traitor? This was a side of James's war experience she'd never known. He'd always been so careful in his letters, so reassuring. He'd talked about the camaraderie, the mud, the endless waiting. He'd never mentioned anything about espionage, about danger beyond the battlefield. She turned the page. Another entry, dated a week later. I have a lead. It's someone close. Someone I never suspected. I need to gather more evidence. I'm meeting with a contact tomorrow. Codename, Nightingale. Nightingale. The word sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, not the reality of her husband's life. She continued reading, flipping through the pages, her heart pounding with each new revelation. James had been involved in something far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. He'd been investigating a traitor, someone within his own unit. The last entry was dated November 10th, 1918, the day before the armistice, the day before James was reported killed in action. I have the proof. I know who it is. I'm going to expose them. Tomorrow, the war will end, and this treachery will end with it. I'll be home soon, Maggie. I promise. Margaret closed the notebook, her hands shaking. James hadn't died in a random shell attack, as she'd been told. He'd been on the verge of exposing a traitor, and he'd been killed the very next day. The implication was clear. James had been murdered. The attic suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper. The dust motes swirled around her, like whispers in the air. Look for me in the quiet moments. She looked at the uniform again, at the notebook in her hand. She had to find out the truth. She had to find out who Nightingale was, who the traitor was, and who had killed her husband. She owed it to James. And she owed it to herself. This wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about justice. It was about uncovering a secret that had been buried for 4 years, a secret that had cost James his life. And she wouldn't rest until she found it. Chapter 3. The vow he kept, the secret he hid. Margaret carefully placed the notebook back inside the lining of the uniform jacket, a knot of determination tightening in her chest. The attic, once a repository of dusty memories, now felt like the starting point of a dangerous journey. She needed to be methodical, to approach this like James would have, with logic and caution. First, she needed to understand the context. What was James's unit? What were their objectives? Who were his superior officers? She remembered him mentioning the 307th Infantry, 77th Division, the Metropolitan Division. They called it filled with men from New York City. She'd sent him care packages to that address, knitted him socks, prayed for his safe return from that unit. She decided to start with his other belongings. She systematically began searching through the trunks and boxes, her initial grief replaced by a focused intensity. She found his letters, carefully bundled and tied with ribbon. She'd read them countless times, but now she scanned them with a new perspective, searching for any hint of the secret he'd been carrying. The letters were, as always, filled with his love for her, his descriptions of the mundane aspects of war, and his longing for home. But now, she noticed subtle changes in tone. Before July 1918, the letters were relatively lighthearted, even humorous at times. After that date, they became more guarded, more focused on the war effort, with fewer personal details. He'd stopped mentioning the names of his fellow soldiers, stopped describing his daily routine. He was being careful. She found a small, worn photograph tucked inside one of the letters. It showed James with a group of soldiers, all in uniform, standing in front of a bombed-out building. They looked young, their faces a mixture of bravado and weariness. She examined each face carefully, wondering if one of them held the key to James's death. One man in particular caught her eye. He stood slightly apart from the others, his expression unreadable. He was tall, with sharp features and dark, intense eyes. There was something about him, something that made her uneasy. She didn't recognize him from James's descriptions. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in James's handwriting, were the names of the soldiers. The man who'd caught her attention was identified as Captain Alistair Finch. Margaret felt a jolt of recognition. Finch. The name was vaguely familiar. She searched her memory, trying to place it. Then she remembered. James had mentioned him once, in a passing remark, in one of his early letters. Captain Finch is a stickler for rules, he'd written, but he's a fair man. A fair man? Or a traitor? Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline. She needed to learn more about Captain Finch. She needed to find out if he was still alive, and if so, where he was. She also needed to decipher the meaning of nightingale. Was it a person, a place, or a code for something else entirely? The notebook provided no further clues. She decided to take the uniform and the notebook downstairs. She couldn't stay in the attic any longer. The air felt too heavy, the silence too oppressive. As she descended the stairs, she felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. She glanced back at the attic door, a sense of unease settling over her. She had the distinct feeling that she wasn't just uncovering a secret, she was disturbing something that had been deliberately hidden, something that someone wanted to remain buried. And she had a feeling that finding the truth would be far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The vows, the uniform, the notebook, they were breadcrumbs, leading her down a path she couldn't yet see, but one she knew she must follow, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. A stranger's face in faded photographs. Downstairs, in the relative normalcy of her small parlor, Margaret spread out James's belongings on the worn Persian rug. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the faded photographs, the neatly folded uniform, and the worn leather notebook. She felt a pang of sadness, surrounded by these remnants of her past, but the sadness was now intertwined with a sense of purpose, a fierce determination to uncover the truth. She started with the photograph again, focusing on Captain Alistair Finch. His image seemed to radiate a coldness, a detachment that contrasted sharply with the weary camaraderie of the other soldiers. She studied his features, the sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, the thin, almost cruel mouth. There was something about him that didn't sit right, a sense of hidden depths, of unspoken secrets. She decided to search for more information about Finch. She knew James had kept meticulous records, even during the war. She went to his study, a small, book-lined room that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. She hadn't been able to bring herself to clear out this room. It felt too much like a violation of his private space. She searched through his desk, finding neatly organized files, letters, and documents. She found his enlistment papers, his officer training records, and his discharge papers officially listing his cause of death as killed in action during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, in a locked drawer, she found a small, black book. It was a directory of officers in the 77th Division, meticulously compiled by James. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding, until she found the entry for Finch, Alistair J., Captain, 307th Infantry. Born, 1888, New York City. Education, Columbia University. Pre-war occupation lawyer. There was a handwritten note next to Finch's entry. See File 12B. Margaret's pulse quickened. File 12B. What was in that file? She searched the desk again, her fingers flying over the drawers and compartments. Finally, in the back of the bottom drawer, she found a series of numbered files. She pulled out File 12B. It was thin, containing only a few documents. The first was a letter, dated October 1918, from a British intelligence officer, Major Thomas Ashton. The letter was addressed to James. Dear Captain Calloway, it read, "We have received your information regarding Captain Finch. We share your concerns. His pre-war connections to certain individuals are troubling. We are conducting our own investigation. We urge you to proceed with extreme caution. Finch is a dangerous man." Margaret's breath hitched. James had been working with British intelligence. He'd been investigating Finch, and the British had confirmed his suspicions. Finch had connections. What kind of connections? The next document was a handwritten report in James's writing, detailing Finch's movements and activities over a period of several weeks. James had observed Finch meeting with unknown individuals, making clandestine phone calls, and receiving suspicious packages. He'd noted Finch's frequent trips to a particular address in a known German-American neighborhood in the city. The final document was a photograph. It was grainy and blurred, but it clearly showed Finch meeting with a man in a dark coat and hat. The man's face was obscured, but there was something familiar about his posture, his build. Margaret couldn't quite place it, but it sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Margaret closed the file, her mind racing. Finch was clearly involved in something shady, something that had caught the attention of both James and British intelligence. But what was it? And how did it connect to James's death? She needed to find Major Ashton. He might have more information about Finch, about the investigation. She looked at the letter again. It was sent from a London address. She decided to write to him, to explain who she was and what she'd found. As she sat down at James's desk to compose the letter, she felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. The events of the day had taken their toll. But she couldn't rest.
Not yet.
She had a feeling that time was of the essence. She had to find the truth before it was too late. And as she penned the letter, a nagging feeling persisted. The man in the photograph with Finch, she'd seen him before. Somewhere. But where? The answer, she felt, was lurking just beneath the surface of her memory, a key piece of the puzzle she desperately needed to unlock. Chapter 5. The Letter from Amiens. The letter to Major Ashton felt like a lifeline thrown into a turbulent sea. Margaret poured out her story, recounting the discovery of the uniform, the notebook, and the contents of File 12B. She emphasized her belief that James had been murdered and her desperate need for answers. She mailed the letter the next morning, feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. In the meantime, she decided to focus on the Nightingale clue. The notebook mentioned a meeting with a contact using that codename. Margaret racked her brain, trying to recall if James had ever mentioned anyone or anything that might fit. She reread his letters, searching for any hidden references, any coded messages. She found nothing. The letters were frustratingly devoid of any concrete information about his intelligence work. He'd been too careful, too discreet. Then, she remembered something. James had sent her a postcard from Amiens, France, a few weeks before he died. It was a simple picture of the Amiens Cathedral, a beautiful, Gothic structure that had somehow survived the ravages of war. She'd kept the postcard tucked away in a small box of keepsakes. She retrieved the box and found the postcard. She turned it over. On the back, James had written a short message. "My dearest Margaret, this cathedral is a testament to resilience, a symbol of hope amidst the destruction. I think of you constantly. I long for the day when I can return to you, to the life we've built together. All my love, James." It was a typical message, filled with his usual affection and longing. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. In the bottom corner of the postcard, in tiny, almost imperceptible letters, he'd written, "Nightingale sings at dusk." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Nightingale sings at dusk. Was this a clue? Was it a reference to the meeting place with his contact?
Amiens.
She knew from James's letters that he'd been stationed near Amiens for several months. She also knew that Amiens Cathedral was a significant landmark, a place that would be easily recognizable. Sings at dusk. What did that mean? Margaret pondered the phrase, her mind working furiously. Dusk, the time of day when the light fades, when shadows lengthen, when secrets are often revealed. She had a sudden intuition. She remembered reading about the cathedral's famous stained glass windows, how they glowed with vibrant colors in the setting sun. Could Nightingale be a reference to one of the windows? A specific window that depicted a nightingale? She needed to see the cathedral, or at least a picture of it. She went to the local library, hoping to find a book on French architecture, on Amiens Cathedral specifically. After hours of searching, she found a large, illustrated volume on the cathedrals of France. She eagerly turned to the section on Amiens. She found detailed descriptions of the cathedral's architecture, its history, and its stained glass windows. And then she found it, a photograph of a small, circular window, high up in the cathedral's north transept. It depicted a nightingale, perched on a branch, its beak open in song. The caption read, "The Nightingale Window, known for its exquisite depiction of the bird's song at dusk." Margaret felt a surge of excitement. This had to be it. The Nightingale window. The meeting place. James had been sending her a message, a subtle clue hidden in plain sight. But what did it mean? Who was he meeting there?
And why?
She had a feeling that the answer to those questions would lead her closer to the truth about James's death. And she knew that she had to go to Amiens. She had to see the Nightingale window for herself. She had to follow in James's footsteps, to uncover the secrets he'd been guarding, even if it meant facing danger herself. The postcard, the window, the coded message. It was all coming together, painting a picture far more intricate and perilous than she'd ever imagined. Chapter 6. The Woman with Eyes Like the Somme. The decision to go to Amiens was impulsive, reckless even, but Margaret felt an undeniable pull, a sense of urgency that wouldn't let her rest. She booked passage on the next available ship to France, a journey that would take several days. She told no one of her plans, except for a brief, vague note to her neighbor, Mrs. Davison, asking her to keep an eye on the house. The voyage was long and arduous, the ship battling rough seas and strong winds. Margaret spent most of her time in her small cabin, poring over James's notebook and the contents of File 12B. She reread every entry, every detail, trying to piece together the puzzle of his secret life. She also thought about Captain Finch. She imagined him, the cold, calculating officer in the photograph, the man who had been under suspicion by both James and British intelligence. What role had he played in James's death? Was he the traitor? She arrived in France a week later, feeling exhausted but determined. She traveled by train to Amiens, a city still bearing the scars of war. Buildings were pockmarked with bullet holes, streets were lined with rubble, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. She found a small, modest hotel near the cathedral. From her window, she could see the towering spire of the cathedral, reaching towards the sky like a prayer. It was a breathtaking sight, even amidst the surrounding devastation. The next morning, Margaret went to the cathedral. She entered the vast, echoing space, her footsteps muffled by the thick stone floor. The air was cool and still, filled with the scent of incense and old stone. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. She walked slowly through the cathedral, her eyes searching for the Nightingale window. She found it in the north transept, high above the floor, just as the book had described. It was a small, circular window, depicting a nightingale perched on a branch, its beak open in song. The glass glowed with rich colors, shades of blue, green, and gold. She stood there for a long time, gazing at the window, feeling a strange connection to James. He had stood here too, she thought. He had looked at this same window, perhaps waiting for his contact, perhaps knowing that his life was in danger. She decided to wait. She would come back to the cathedral at dusk, just as James had instructed in his coded message. She would see who, if anyone, came to the Nightingale window. She spent the rest of the day exploring Amiens, trying to get a sense of the city, of the atmosphere that James had experienced. She visited the local market, where vendors sold everything from fresh produce to war souvenirs. She walked along the Somme River, its waters flowing slowly, silently, carrying the memories of countless battles. As dusk approached, she returned to the cathedral. She found a quiet corner near the Nightingale window, where she could observe without being seen. She sat on a wooden bench, her heart pounding, her senses alert. The light began to fade, the colors in the stained glass windows deepening. The cathedral grew quieter, the sounds of the city fading away. And then she saw her. A woman, tall and slender, dressed in a dark coat and hat, walked slowly towards the Nightingale window. She stopped beneath the window, her head tilted back, as if gazing at the nightingale. Margaret watched her intently, her breath held captive in her chest. The woman stood there for several minutes, her face obscured by the shadows. Then, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, white object. It looked like a handkerchief. She held it up to the window, as if signaling someone. Margaret strained to see, but the light was too dim. She couldn't make out the woman's features. But there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at Margaret's memory. Then, the woman turned, and for a brief moment, the light caught her face. Margaret gasped. She knew those eyes. They were the color of the Somme River, a murky, gray-green, filled with a haunting sadness. She'd seen those eyes before, in a photograph, in a dream, in a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The woman that she was somehow connected to James, to the war, to the secret he died protecting. And Margaret knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was looking at Nightingale. Chapter 7. The Lies We Told for King and Country. The encounter with the woman with Nightingale left Margaret shaken. The woman's haunting eyes, the way she'd held the handkerchief to the window, the sense of familiarity, it all pointed to a deeper connection, a hidden history that Margaret was only beginning to uncover. She followed the woman at a distance as she left the cathedral, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The woman walked briskly through the darkening streets, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, navigating the maze like streets with ease. Margaret struggled to keep up, her sensible shoes ill-suited for the uneven terrain. She lost sight of the woman several times, only to catch a glimpse of her dark coat disappearing around a corner. Finally, the woman stopped in front of a small, unassuming building. It looked like a private residence, with a dark wooden door and curtained windows. The woman glanced around, as if checking to see if she was being followed, then quickly slipped inside. Margaret hesitated. Should she follow her? Should she confront her? She didn't know what to do. She felt a surge of fear, but also a fierce determination to find out the truth. She decided to wait. She found a shadowed doorway across the street, where she could observe the building without being seen. She waited for what felt like an eternity, the cold night air seeping into her bones. After about an hour, the door opened and the woman emerged. She was accompanied by a man. Margaret couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but she recognized his build, his posture. It was the man from the photograph, the man who'd been meeting with Captain Finch. Margaret felt a jolt of recognition. She remembered where she'd seen him before. He was one of the soldiers in the group photograph with James standing next to Finch. She dismissed him as just another soldier, but now she realized that he was a key player in this unfolding drama. She watched as the woman and the man walked away, their voices low and indistinct. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could sense the tension between them, the urgency in their movements. She followed them again, keeping her distance, her heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. They led her to a deserted part of the city, near the old railway yards. The area was filled with abandoned warehouses, rusting trucks, and piles of rubble. The woman and the man stopped in front of a large, dilapidated warehouse. The man produced a key and unlocked the door. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. Margaret waited, her mind racing. What were they doing in this deserted place? What was their connection to James? And to Finch? She knew she had to find out. She couldn't just stand by and watch. She had to confront them. She had to get answers. She approached the warehouse cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever she might find inside. The lies they had told, the secrets they had kept hidden, were all buried here, it seemed. And the cost of those secrets was evident everywhere she looked. She pushed the heavy door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, into the darkness, ready to face the truth, whatever it might be. The weight of duty, of country, of a war that had ended, but still cast long shadows, it all crashed around her. Chapter 8. A Dance of Shadows and Half-Truths. The warehouse was vast and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of dust, rust, and something else, something acrid, almost metallic. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant rumble of a train. Margaret moved slowly, cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She could see crates piled high, stacks of old machinery, and piles of rubble. The place felt abandoned, forgotten, like a relic of a bygone era. Then she heard voices. They were coming from the far end of the warehouse, muffled and indistinct. She crept closer, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She reached a corner and peered around it. She saw the woman and the man, standing in a small, cleared area. They were illuminated by a single, flickering lantern, their faces cast in a pale, ghostly light. The man was speaking, his voice low and urgent. "We have to be careful," he said. "They're getting closer. They suspect something." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with worry. "I know," she said, "but we can't stop now. We're too close. We have to finish what we started." Margaret listened intently, trying to make sense of their conversation. They were talking about being close, about finishing what we started. What were they talking about? The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, metal box. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. Margaret recognized the box. It was identical to the one James had used to store his intelligence files. The man handed the box to the woman. "Take this," he said. "It's the evidence. It's everything we need to expose him." "Expose him? Who are they talking about? Finch?" The woman took the box, her hands trembling. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll stay here," the man said. "I'll create a diversion. I'll give you time to get away." A diversion? What did he mean? Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a crash from the other end of the warehouse. The man and the woman jumped, startled. "They're here," the man said.
"Go. Now."
The woman hesitated, her eyes filled with fear and indecision.
"Go."
The man shouted. "I'll be all right. Just go." The woman turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. The man turned to face the direction of the noise, his hand reaching inside his coat, as if reaching for a weapon. Margaret watched, frozen in place, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to do. Should she run? Should she help the man? Should she try to find the woman? Then she saw him. Captain Alistair Finch stepped out of the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury. He was holding a gun. Well, Finch said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. Sergeant Miller. Still playing spy, I see." So, the man was Sergeant Miller. The soldier from the photograph, the one who'd been meeting with Finch. Miller stood his ground, his eyes defiant. "It's over, Finch," he said. "We have the evidence. We know what you did." Finch laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "You have nothing," he said. "And you won't live to tell anyone what you think you know." He raised his gun and pointed it at Miller. Margaret knew she had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch Finch murder Miller. She stepped out of the shadows, her voice trembling but firm. "Stop," she shouted. "Don't do it." Finch turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He stared at Margaret, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. The dance was over, it seemed. The truth was out. Or was it? More questions filled her mind. She felt like she'd just a player in a twisted and elaborate game. Chapter 9. The Scent of Gunpowder and Regret. Finch's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening as he took in Margaret's appearance. The surprise on his face quickly morphed into a cold, calculating assessment. He lowered his gun slightly, but the menace in his posture remained. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, yet edged with steel. "What a surprise. What brings you to this charming locale?" Margaret stood her ground, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. "I know about you, Finch," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know what you did to James." Finch raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Did to James? My dear Mrs. Calloway, your husband died a hero's death. A tragic accident of war." "That's a lie," Margaret retorted, her voice gaining strength. "He was murdered. He was about to expose you." Finch chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Expose me? For what? Winning the war? For being a traitor," Margaret shot back, the word hanging heavy in the air. "For selling information to the enemy." Finch's amusement vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "You have no proof," he hissed. James had proof, Margaret countered. And Sergeant Miller has proof. She glanced at Miller, who was watching the exchange with a grim expression. Finch followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. Miller is a delusional fool, he said. He's been obsessed with me since the war. He blames me for his failures. Miller stepped forward, his voice tight with anger.
You know that's not true, Finch.
You were selling information to the Germans. You were responsible for the deaths of countless men, including Captain Calloway. Finch sneered. You have no evidence, Miller. Just your word against mine. We have the box, Margaret said, stepping forward. The one you gave to Nightingale. Finch's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of alarm crossing his face. He hadn't expected that. Nightingale? He said, his voice regaining its composure. And who, pray tell, is Nightingale? Before Margaret could answer, a voice spoke from the shadows. I am, said the woman, stepping into the light. She was holding the metal box, her expression resolute. Finch stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. Elise? He whispered. You betrayed me?
Elise.
So that was her name. Elise nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. I did, she said. I couldn't let you continue. I couldn't live with the guilt any longer. Finch looked from Elise to Margaret to Miller, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The scent of gunpowder, the residue of his past, the war, the betrayals, all swirled around them. The regret was palpable, hanging in the stale air. You were working with James, Margaret said to Elise, her voice filled with a sudden understanding. You were his contact. You were Nightingale. Elise nodded again. Yes, she said. James and we were trying to stop Finch. We were trying to expose his treachery.
But why?
Margaret asked. Why did you wait so long? Elise looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I was afraid, she said. Finch, he had power. He had connections. He threatened me. He threatened my family. But you knew about James, Margaret said. You knew he was murdered. Elise looked up, her eyes filled with tears. Yes, she said. I knew. And I've lived with that guilt every day since. I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway. I'm so sorry. The truth, raw and painful, hung in the air. James hadn't died a hero's death, as she'd been told. He'd been murdered by a man he'd once trusted, a man who'd betrayed his country and his comrades. And Elise, Nightingale, had been a reluctant accomplice, caught in a web of fear and deceit. The warehouse, the shadows, the confessions, was all a far cry from the quiet life she had known with James. And yet it was all connected. Chapter 10. The Price of Silence, the Cost of Love. The silence that followed Elise's confession was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the four people caught in this tangled web of wartime secrets. Finch, his face a mask of rage and despair, looked like a cornered animal. Miller, his expression grim but resolute, stood ready to act. Elise, her shoulders slumped with the weight of her guilt, looked utterly defeated. Margaret, her mind reeling from the revelations, felt a surge of anger, grief, and a strange sense of closure. The truth, as painful as it was finally out in the open. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. It was Miller who answered. Now, he said, his voice firm, Finch is brought to justice. And the truth is revealed. Finch, seeing his carefully constructed world collapsing around him, made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. You can't prove anything, he said, his voice regaining some of its former arrogance. It's your word against mine. And Elise, she's a known collaborator. No one will believe her. They'll believe the evidence, Miller said, gesturing towards the metal box in Elise's hands. The documents, the photographs, the names, it's all there. Finch's eyes darted towards the box, a flicker of desperation in his gaze. He knew he was trapped. Suddenly, he lunged towards Elise, his hand reaching for the box. Miller reacted instantly, tackling Finch to the ground. The two men struggled, their bodies grappling in the dim light. Margaret, fearing for Miller's safety, stepped forward to help. But Elise stopped her. No, Elise said, her voice surprisingly strong. This is my fight. I have to do this. She handed the box to Margaret.
Keep this safe, she said.
It's the truth. It's James's legacy. Elise then joined the fray, helping Miller subdue Finch. The two of them, working together, managed to overpower the former captain, pinning him to the ground. Finch, defeated and humiliated, glared at them, his eyes filled with hatred. You'll pay for this, he hissed. You'll all pay for this. Miller ignored him. He looked at Margaret. We need to call the authorities, he said. The police, the military, everyone. Margaret nodded, her hand clutching the metal box. She knew what she had to do. She had to make sure that Finch faced justice, that James's death was avenged, and that the truth was finally revealed to the world. As she walked out of the warehouse, leaving Miller and Elise to deal with Finch, she felt a profound sense of sadness, but also a sense of relief. The price of silence had been high, paid for with James's life and Elise's years of guilt. The cost of love, her love for James, had led her on this dangerous journey, but it had also given her the strength to face the truth and to fight for justice. The war might be over, but the battles continued, fought not on battlefields, but in the shadows, in the hearts and minds of those who had survived. And Margaret, the quiet, grieving widow, had become a warrior in her own right. Chapter 11. Beneath the cobblestones of memory. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Margaret, with Miller and Elise's help, contacted the authorities, both American and British military intelligence, as well as the local French police. Finch was arrested, the metal box providing irrefutable evidence of his treason. The story made headlines in both France and the United States, a sensational tale of wartime espionage, betrayal, and murder. Margaret found herself thrust into the spotlight, interviewed by reporters, questioned by investigators, and hailed as a heroine. She handled it all with a quiet dignity, her focus remaining on securing justice for James and ensuring that Finch paid for his crimes. Elise, initially treated with suspicion due to her past association with Finch, was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. Her testimony, along with the evidence in the box, proved crucial in securing Finch's conviction. She was seen as a victim, a woman who had been coerced and manipulated by a powerful and ruthless man. Miller, vindicated at last, was lauded for his persistence and his unwavering belief in James's innocence. He had finally cleared his name and avenged his friend's death. Margaret, however, found little solace in the public accolades. The truth, while satisfying, had also opened up old wounds, forcing her to relive the pain of James's death and to confront the reality of his secret life. She decided to stay in Amiens for a while longer, to visit the places James had known, to walk the streets he had walked, to try to understand the world he had inhabited during those final, fateful months. She visited the American cemetery, where many of James's comrades were buried. She found his grave, a simple white cross among rows and rows of identical markers. She stood there for a long time, tears streaming down her face, feeling a profound sense of loss, but also a sense of connection. She also revisited the Amiens Cathedral, spending hours gazing at the Nightingale window. She felt a strange kinship with Elise, a shared understanding of the burdens they had both carried, the secrets they had both kept. One evening, as she was walking back to her hotel, she passed by the building where Elise had met with Miller, the building where the final confrontation with Finch had taken place. She stopped, looking at the dark wooden door, the curtained windows. She had a sudden urge to go inside, to see the place where James's fate had been sealed. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, as if there was something more to be discovered. She tried the door handle. To her surprise, it was unlocked. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The building was dark and silent, the air thick with the smell of dust and old paper. It looked like it had been used as an office, with desks, chairs, and filing cabinets scattered around. She walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She found nothing of interest, just the remnants of a forgotten business. Then, in one of the back rooms, she saw something that caught her eye. It was a small, wooden chest, tucked away in a corner. It looked old, its surface covered with intricate carvings. She knelt down and examined the chest. It was locked. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She searched for a key, but couldn't find one. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she noticed something. There was a small, almost imperceptible inscription on the front of the chest, beneath the lock. It was a single word, remember. Remember. The word echoed in her mind. It was a word James had used often, in his letters, in his vows. She had a sudden intuition. She remembered the small, silver locket James had always worn. The one he'd said contained a picture of her. He'd been wearing it when he died. She'd never seen it again. Could the locket be the key? She knew it was a long shot, but she had to try. She went back to her hotel and retrieved the small box of James's belongings that she'd brought with her. She searched through the box, but the locket wasn't there. Then she remembered. She'd given the locket to Miller as a token of her gratitude for his help. She rushed to Miller's hotel, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found him in his room, packing his belongings, preparing to return to the United States. She explained her theory about the locket and the chest. Miller, initially skeptical, agreed to help. They returned to the building, Miller carrying the locket. Margaret knelt down in front of the chest, her hands trembling. She took the locket and carefully inserted it into the lock. It fit. She turned the locket, and with a click, the chest opened. Beneath the cobblestones of her memory, she found the next piece. Chapter 12. The Cipher in the Seam. Inside the chest, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, rolled-up piece of parchment. It was tied with a thin, silk ribbon, the same shade of blue as James's uniform. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for it, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. This felt different, more personal than the military documents in the metal box. She carefully untied the ribbon and unrolled the parchment. It was a letter, written in James's familiar handwriting, but unlike his other letters, this one was addressed not to her, but to an unknown recipient. My dearest friend, it began. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means that Finch has succeeded, and that I am no longer alive to stop him. I am writing this letter as a last resort, a final attempt to expose the truth and to protect the woman I love. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. This letter was a contingency plan, a message from beyond the grave, intended for someone James trusted implicitly. I have discovered that Finch's treachery goes far deeper than I initially suspected. He is not just selling information to the Germans, he is part of a larger conspiracy, a network of individuals within the Allied forces who are working to prolong the war for their own personal gain. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Finch wasn't just a traitor, he was part of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. I have gathered evidence of this conspiracy, but it is too dangerous to keep it with me. I have hidden it in a place where only you can find it. It is concealed within the lining of my uniform jacket, in the seam beneath the left shoulder pad. There is a cipher stitched into the fabric, a code that will reveal the location of the evidence. Margaret gasped. The uniform. The one she'd found in the attic. The one that had started this whole journey. You must retrieve the uniform and decipher the code. You must expose the conspiracy and bring the traitors to justice. You must do this for me, for my country, and for Margaret. She is my life, my love, my everything. Protect her, my friend. She is in danger. Finch knows that she is a threat to him. He will try to silence her. Margaret felt a surge of fear, but also a sense of determination. James had entrusted her with this mission, even in death. She had to find the cipher, decipher the code, and expose the conspiracy. I know this is a dangerous task, my friend, but I have faith in you. You are the only one I can trust. You are the only one who can finish what I started. Yours eternally, James. Margaret carefully rolled up the letter and placed it back in the chest. She closed the chest and locked it with a locket, her mind racing. She had to get back to New York. She had to retrieve the uniform and find the cipher. She turned to Miller, her eyes filled with urgency.
We need to go back, she said. Now.
Miller, seeing the determination in her eyes, nodded. He understood. He knew that James's mission was not yet complete. They left the building, leaving behind the shadows and the secrets, and stepped out into the night air. Margaret clutched the locket tightly in her hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a grieving widow, she was James's partner, his confidant, his protector. She was the keeper of his secrets, the executor of his final wishes. As they walked towards the train station, Margaret looked up at the night sky, at the stars that had witnessed so much history, so much suffering, so much love. She felt a strange sense of peace, a sense of connection to James, a sense that he was with her, guiding her, protecting her. The cipher and the seam, the code, the conspiracy, it was all waiting for her. And she was ready. Chapter 13. The Midnight Rendezvous at Grand Central. The return journey to New York was fraught with a sense of urgency. Margaret, clutching the small, silver locket now more than ever a tangible link to James, spent the long hours at sea replaying every detail, every clue, every conversation in her mind. The letter in the chest had revealed a conspiracy far grander and more dangerous than she'd initially imagined, and the cipher in the uniform was the key to unraveling it all. She and Miller barely spoke, each lost in their own thoughts, their shared mission a silent bond between them. Miller, she knew, felt a deep sense of responsibility to finish what James had started, to honor his friend's memory and bring the remaining conspirators to justice. Upon arriving in New York, Margaret went straight home, the familiar streets of her neighborhood a stark contrast to the war-torn landscape of Amiens. The house felt empty, haunted by James's absence, yet also strangely alive with his presence, with the secrets it held. She went directly to the attic, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found the uniform exactly where she'd left it, laid out on the old armchair, as if waiting for her return. She picked up the jacket, the heavy wool feeling strangely comforting in her hands. She carefully examined the left shoulder pad, her fingers tracing the seam, just as James had described in his letter. She found it. A small, almost imperceptible series of stitches, different from the rest, forming a pattern, a code. It was a cipher, intricately woven into the fabric, a secret message hidden in plain sight. She needed to decipher it. She remembered James mentioning a book on cryptography he'd owned, a book he'd used during his intelligence training. She went to his study, her fingers flying over the bookshelves, searching for the familiar title. She found it, tucked away on a high shelf, a thick, leather-bound volume titled Codes and Ciphers of the Great War. She pulled it down, her hands trembling, and opened it to the index. She found a section on substitution ciphers, the type of code commonly used during the war. She scanned the pages, her eyes searching for a pattern that matched the one on the uniform. After hours of painstaking work, she found it. It was a variation of the Vigenère cipher, a complex polyalphabetic substitution code that used a keyword to encrypt and decrypt messages. But what was the keyword? She racked her brain, trying to think of anything James might have used, a word, a phrase, a date that had significance to them. She tried their wedding date, her name, his unit number. Nothing worked. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she remembered the locket. The inscription, remember. Could that be it? She carefully applied the keyword remember to the cipher on the uniform, using the method described in the book. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to decode the message. The first few letters didn't make sense. Then, gradually, words began to emerge. Grand Central Station, Locker 22B, midnight, July 12th. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Grand Central Station, Locker 22B, midnight, July 12th. That was tomorrow. It was a rendezvous, a meeting place. Someone was expecting something or someone at that locker. She knew she had to be there. She had to see who or what was waiting. She looked at the date again. July 12th. It was their wedding anniversary. James had planned this, she realized. He'd set this up as a contingency, a way to ensure that the evidence would be found, even if he was gone. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of grief, admiration, and love. He'd thought of everything. He'd protected her, even from beyond the grave. She contacted Miller, telling him about the decoded message and the rendezvous at Grand Central. He agreed to meet her there. As midnight approached, Margaret and Miller stood in the vast, echoing concourse of Grand Central Station, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They found locker 22B, a small, metal locker tucked away in a quiet corner. They waited. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, at precisely midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and slender, dressed in a dark coat and hat. He walked directly to locker 22B, his movements purposeful, his face obscured by the shadows. Margaret and Miller watched, hidden in the darkness, ready to act. The rendezvous, the locker, the cipher, it was all coming to a head. And Margaret knew that this was just the beginning of the final act. Chapter 14. The Train to Nowhere, The Journey to Everywhere. The man approached locker 22B with a key in hand, his movements swift and practiced. He glanced around, seemingly unfazed by the late hour and the deserted concourse. Margaret, hidden with Miller in the shadows of a nearby pillar, felt a prickle of unease. There was something familiar about the man, a vague sense of recognition that tugged at her memory. He inserted the key, the lock clicked open, and he pulled out a small, leather satchel. It was worn and weathered, looking as though it had traveled many miles. He didn't open it, but clutched it tightly to his chest, as if it contained something precious. Before he could turn to leave, Miller stepped out of the shadows, his voice firm and commanding. "Hold it right there," he said. "We need to talk." The man froze, his body tensing. He slowly turned, his face still obscured by the shadows of his hat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "We know about the cipher," Margaret said, stepping forward. "We know about the conspiracy." The man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He looked from Margaret to Miller, assessing the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice regaining its composure.
"Don't play dumb," Miller said. "We know you were expecting this."
He gestured towards the satchel. The man hesitated, his hand tightening around the satchel. He seemed to be weighing his options. Then suddenly he bolted. He dropped the satchel and ran, disappearing into the maze of corridors and platforms. Miller reacted instantly, giving chase. Margaret picked up the satchel, her heart pounding. She had a feeling that this bag held the final piece of the puzzle. She followed Miller, trying to keep up with his long strides. They chased the man through the deserted station, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The man was fast, agile, weaving through the obstacles with ease. He seemed to know the station like the back of his hand. Finally, they cornered him on a platform, near a waiting train. The train was empty, its engine idling, ready to depart. The man turned to face them, his face now visible in the dim light. Margaret gasped. She knew him. It was Major Thomas Ashton, the British intelligence officer who'd written to James, warning him about Finch. "Ashton?" Margaret said, her voice filled with disbelief. "But you were helping James." Ashton smiled, a cold, cynical smile. "Helping James?"
he said.
"I was using James. He was a pawn in a much larger game." "You were part of the conspiracy," Miller said, his voice tight with anger. "You were working with Finch." Ashton nodded. "Finch was a useful idiot," he said. "But he was expendable. The real power lies elsewhere." "Where?" Margaret demanded. "Who else is involved?" Ashton laughed. "You'll never know," he said. "It's too late. The plan is already in motion." He glanced at the waiting train. "And now, if you'll excuse me," he said, "I have a train to catch." He turned and jumped onto the train, disappearing into one of the carriages. Miller tried to follow, but the train doors slammed shut, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed. Margaret and Miller watched as the train pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. They were left standing on the platform, the satchel in Margaret's hand, the truth still eluding them. "What was that all about?" Miller asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Where is that train going?" Margaret didn't know. But she had a feeling that the satchel held the answer. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling. Inside, she found a collection of documents, photographs, and maps. She also found a small, handwritten notebook, similar to the one James had kept. She began to examine the contents, her mind racing. The documents revealed a network of individuals, high-ranking military officers, politicians, and businessmen, all involved in a plot to prolong the war for their own financial gain. The photographs showed secret meetings, clandestine exchanges, and incriminating evidence. The maps detailed troop movements, supply routes, and strategic locations. The notebook contained Ashton's notes, his observations, his plans. It was a detailed record of the conspiracy, a blueprint for their treachery. And then she found it. A single entry, dated July 12th, the day of their wedding anniversary. Operation Nightingale, final phase. The train to nowhere. The journey to everywhere. The price of peace is paid in blood. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Operation Nightingale. It wasn't just a code name for Elise, it was the name of the entire operation. And the train, it was part of the plan. But what did it mean? The train to nowhere. The journey to everywhere. Where was the train going? And what was its purpose? The answer, she knew, was hidden somewhere within these documents. And she had to find it before it was too late. The satchel, the train, Ashton's escape, it was all a carefully orchestrated plan. And she was right in the middle of it. Chapter 15. The Scarred Hand, the Healing Touch. The contents of Ashton's satchel were a chilling revelation, a roadmap of betrayal that reached the highest echelons of power. Margaret and Miller spent hours poring over the documents, photographs, and maps, piecing together the intricate web of the conspiracy. The scale of it was breathtaking, the audacity almost unbelievable. They discovered that the conspirators, driven by greed and a lust for power, had been manipulating events on both sides of the conflict, prolonging the war to line their own pockets. They had been supplying arms and intelligence to both the Allies and the Central Powers, fueling the carnage and profiting from the bloodshed. Ashton's notebook was particularly revealing, detailing his role as a key orchestrator of the plot. He had been using his position in British intelligence to manipulate information, sabotage peace efforts, and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the truth, including James. The phrase "the train to nowhere," the journey to everywhere, continued to haunt Margaret. It was clearly a metaphor, but for what? She examined the maps again, searching for any clue, any indication of the train's destination or purpose. She found a map of the eastern United States, with a series of railway lines marked in red. One line in particular caught her attention. It was a small, obscure branch line that ran through a remote, sparsely populated area of upstate New York. The line terminated at a small, abandoned mining town called Oakhaven. Oakhaven. The name rang a bell. She searched her memory, trying to place it. Then she remembered. James had mentioned it once, in a passing remark, in one of his letters. He'd said it was a beautiful, secluded place, a perfect spot for a quiet retreat. Could that be it? Could Oakhaven be the train to nowhere? She had a sudden intuition. She remembered reading about the mining industry during the war, how many mines had been repurposed to produce materials for the war effort. Could Oakhaven be a secret facility, a place where the conspirators were manufacturing weapons, or storing supplies, or conducting some other clandestine activity? She shared her theory with Miller. He agreed that it was worth investigating. They decided to go to Oakhaven. They knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. They traveled by train, following the same route that Ashton had taken. The journey was long and tiring, the landscape gradually changing from the bustling city to the quiet, rolling hills of upstate New York. They arrived in Oakhaven late in the afternoon. It was a desolate place, a ghost town, with abandoned buildings, overgrown streets, and a palpable sense of decay. The mine itself was a gaping hole in the earth, surrounded by rusting machinery and piles of slag. They explored the town cautiously, their senses on high alert. They found nothing of interest, just the remnants of a forgotten community. Then, as they were about to give up, they saw something. It was a small, wooden building, hidden away behind a cluster of trees. It looked different from the other buildings, newer, more well-maintained. They approached the building cautiously. They could hear a faint humming sound coming from inside. They tried the door. It was locked. Miller, using his military training, managed to pick the lock. They stepped inside. The building was a small, but well-equipped laboratory. There were tables covered with beakers, test tubes, and other scientific equipment. There were shelves lined with chemicals and supplies. And there was a strong, pungent odor in the air, an odor that Margaret recognized. It was the smell of explosives. They had found it. Oak Haven wasn't just a mining town, it was a secret facility for manufacturing explosives, supplying both sides of the war. And the train it was used to transport the explosives, to distribute them to the conspirators' network. As they were examining the laboratory, they heard a noise. They turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was holding a gun. He was older, his hair graying, but Margaret instantly knew his face. Marked deeply with the scars of experience and something sinister. A long-heeled, puckered gash ran from his temple to his jaw. The other identifying mark, his right hand, was covered with burned scars.
Who are you?
The man asked, his voice rough and menacing. We know about the conspiracy, Margaret said. We know what you're doing here. The man's eyes narrowed. You know too much, he said. He raised his gun. The scarred hand, the healing touch, perverted into something cruel. This man was the linchpin, she was sure of it. The train to nowhere, the journey to everywhere, it all led to this place, to this man, to this moment. The explosive materials, the hidden location. It had been staring right at them, and he was between them and the truth. Chapter 16. The Confession in the Rain. The standoff in the hidden laboratory was tense, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and the threat of violence. The man, his scarred face a mask of cold determination, kept his gun trained on Margaret and Miller, his finger hovering over the trigger. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice low and menacing. This doesn't concern you. It concerns us very much, Margaret retorted, her voice trembling slightly but firm. It concerns my husband, James Calloway. He was murdered because of this conspiracy. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps even regret. But it was quickly gone, replaced by his previous cold demeanor. Your husband was a soldier, he said. He died in the war. It happens. He was murdered, Margaret insisted. By Finch, by Ashton, by you. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You have no proof, he said. We have the evidence, Miller said, stepping forward. The documents, the photographs, Ashton's notebook, it's all there. The man's gaze shifted to Miller, his eyes narrowing. Ashton talked? He said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. He ran, Miller corrected. But he left behind his satchel. We know everything. The man seemed to deflate slightly, his shoulders slumping, his grip on the gun loosening. He looked from Margaret to Miller, his expression a mixture of defeat and resignation. It was all for nothing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. All the planning, all the risk, all the sacrifices. What's your name? Margaret asked, her voice softening slightly. The man hesitated for a moment, then sighed.
Bartholomew, he said.
Bartholomew Thorne.
Thorne.
The name resonated with Margaret. She'd seen it in Ashton's notebook, listed as one of the key players in the conspiracy.
Why?
Margaret asked. Why did you do it? Why did you prolong the war? Thorne looked away, his eyes filled with a distant, haunted look. It started with good intentions, he said. We believed we were saving the world. We believed that the war was a necessary evil, a way to reshape the world order, to create a new era of peace and prosperity. By killing millions of people? Miller said, his voice filled with disgust. Thorne nodded slowly. We believed the ends justified the means, he said. We believed that we were the only ones who could see the bigger picture, the only ones who could make the hard decisions. And the money? Margaret asked. The profits you made from selling arms to both sides? Thorne's face hardened. That was a necessary byproduct, he said. We needed resources to fund our operation, to maintain our influence. You were driven by greed, Margaret said, her voice filled with contempt. By power and greed.
Thorn didn't deny it.
He looked down at his scarred hand, his expression a mixture of shame and regret.
It all went wrong, he said.
It spiraled out of control. We lost sight of our original goals. We became monsters. Suddenly, they heard the sound of approaching sirens, the wail growing louder and louder. Thorn looked up, his eyes widening in alarm. They're here, he said. The police. Miller had contacted the authorities before they entered the laboratory, alerting them to the location and the nature of the conspiracy. Thorn looked at Margaret, his expression pleading.
Don't let them take me, he said.
Please. I'll tell you everything. I'll give you the names, the locations, everything you need to expose the rest of them. Margaret hesitated. She didn't trust Thorn, but she knew that he held the key to dismantling the entire conspiracy. Before she could answer, the laboratory door burst open, and a group of police officers rushed inside, their guns drawn. They quickly apprehended Thorn, handcuffing him and leading him away. As Thorn was being led out, he looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. The rain, he said. The confession in the rain. It's all there. Remember the rain? What did he mean? Margaret watched as Thorn was taken away, her mind racing. She knew that he was referring to something specific, a clue, a final piece of the puzzle. It started to rain, a gentle drizzle at first, then growing heavier, a downpour that soaked the earth and washed away the dust and grime of the abandoned town. It was like nature was crying. Margaret remembered James's use of the word remember, and she started connecting the dots. She looked around the laboratory, her eyes scanning the shelves, the tables, the equipment. She had a feeling that the answer was here, hidden in plain sight. The rain. The confession. It was all connected. And then she knew. Chapter 17. The betrayal that saved us. The rain continued to fall, a relentless downpour that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Margaret's mind. Thorn's cryptic words, the rain. The confession in the rain. It's all there echoed in her thoughts, a riddle wrapped in a confession. She looked around the laboratory again, her gaze lingering on the various bottles and containers. She was looking for something, though she was not entirely sure what. Then her eye alighted on a row of chemical bottles. Most were labeled with their scientific names: sulfuric acid, nitric acid, potassium nitrate. But one bottle was different. It had no label, just a handwritten inscription. Aqua Regia.
Aqua Regia.
Royal water. It was a highly corrosive mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids, known for its ability to dissolve gold. But it was also a term used metaphorically, historically, to refer to a sovereign's power to alter records, rewrite history. The confession in the rain. Not about the rain. In the Aqua Regia. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She carefully picked up the bottle, her hands trembling. She examined it closely, turning it over and over in her hands. She noticed something. There was a small, almost imperceptible piece of paper concealed beneath the bottom of the bottle, held in place by a thin layer of wax. She carefully peeled off the wax and removed the paper. It was a small, folded note, written in Thorn's handwriting. She unfolded it, her breath catching in her throat. It was a confession, a detailed account of the conspiracy, listing the names of all the individuals involved, their roles, their locations, and their crimes. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence they needed to bring down the entire network. But there was something else. At the end of the confession, Thorn had written a personal message to Margaret.
Mrs. Calloway, it read.
I know this will not bring back your husband, but I hope it will bring you some measure of peace. I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for the pain I caused. I was wrong. We were all wrong. There is one more thing you should know. James, he was not supposed to die. He was meant to be a warning, a message to others who might try to interfere. But Finch, he went too far. He acted on his own. He was a loose cannon, a liability. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of grief, anger, and a strange sense of relief. James's death had not been part of the original plan. It had been the result of Finch's own ruthlessness, his own ambition. I betrayed my country, Thorne continued. I betrayed my friends. I betrayed my own conscience. But in the end, it was a betrayal that saved us. By confessing, by revealing the truth, I hope to redeem myself, at least in some small way. Margaret closed the note, her hands shaking. Thorne's confession was a complex and contradictory document, a testament to the human capacity for both good and evil, for both betrayal and redemption. She handed the note to Miller, who had been watching her with a concerned expression. He read it quickly, his eyes widening in disbelief.
"This is it," he said.
"This is everything we need." They left the laboratory, stepping out into the rain, the downpour washing away the grime and the secrets of Oakhaven. They had found the truth, at last. They had exposed the conspiracy, and they had avenged James's death. As they walked back to the train station, Margaret felt a profound sense of closure, a sense that a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, deception, and heartbreak. But it had also been a journey of self-discovery, of resilience, and of love. She had started as a grieving widow, a woman lost in the shadows of the past. But she had emerged as a warrior, a fighter, a woman who had faced the truth and had found the strength to carry on. She had kept her promise to James. She had honored his memory. And she had found a measure of peace. The betrayal that defined so much of the war and its aftermath had ultimately been the key. Chapter 18. The Echoes of Artillery, the Promise of Peace. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, investigations, and media scrutiny. Thorne's confession, along with the evidence gathered from Ashton Satchel and the Oakhaven Laboratory, led to the arrest and prosecution of dozens of individuals involved in the conspiracy. High-ranking military officers, prominent politicians, and wealthy industrialists were exposed, their reputations shattered, their lives ruined. The story dominated headlines around the world, a shocking revelation of wartime greed and corruption. The public was outraged, demanding justice for the countless lives that had been lost and for the betrayal of trust. Margaret, though still grieving for James, found a measure of satisfaction in seeing the conspirators brought to justice. She testified at several trials, her quiet dignity and unwavering determination earning her the respect and admiration of many. She became a symbol of resilience, a voice for the victims of the war, a testament to the power of truth. Miller, his name finally cleared and his friendship with James vindicated, returned to his life, forever changed by the experience. He and Margaret remained in contact, their shared journey forging a bond of friendship that would last a lifetime. Elise, having played a crucial role in exposing the conspiracy, was granted immunity from prosecution and was able to rebuild her life, free from the fear and guilt that had haunted her for so long. She and Margaret met several times, their shared connection to James and the shared trauma they had experienced forming a unique and powerful bond. As the trials concluded and the dust began to settle, Margaret found herself at a crossroads. She had fulfilled her promise to James, she had uncovered the truth, and she had seen justice served. But what now? What was her purpose? Where did she go from here? She decided to return to Amiens, to the place where her journey had begun, to the place where she felt closest to James. She visited the cathedral again, spending hours gazing at the nightingale window, remembering the coded message, the secret meeting, the woman with eyes like the psalm. She visited James's grave, placing a single white rose on the simple cross, whispering a silent goodbye. She had found peace, of a sort, but the ache of his absence remained, a constant reminder of the love she had lost. As she was walking through the cemetery, she noticed a familiar figure standing near a nearby grave. It was Elise. They approached each other, their eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. "I come here often," Elise said, her voice soft and filled with sadness. "To remember. To try to forgive myself." "I understand," Margaret said. "I do the same." They stood in silence for a few moments, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the nearby trees. "What will you do now?"
Elise asked.
Margaret thought for a moment.
I don't know, she said.
I haven't thought that far ahead. I suppose I'll go back to New York.
Try to rebuild my life.
You could stay here, Elise said. In France. Start anew. Margaret considered the suggestion. It was tempting, the idea of escaping the memories, the expectations, the weight of the past. But she knew that she couldn't run away from her life. She had to face it, to embrace it, to find a way to move forward. Thank you, Margaret said. But I think I need to go home. Elise nodded, understanding. Perhaps, she said, we can both find peace, in our own ways, in our own time. They embraced, a silent farewell, a promise of remembrance. Margaret returned to New York, to her empty house, to the ghosts of her past. But she was no longer the same woman who had left. She was stronger. He spoke of his youthful idealism, his belief in a new world order, his seduction by power and greed, his descent into darkness. He spoke of his collaboration with Thorne, his manipulation of James, his role in the conspiracy. He spoke of his regret, his guilt, his shame. He admitted to ordering the sabotage that was meant to warn James, but insisted he'd never intended for him to die. He blamed Finch for escalating the situation, for taking matters into his own hands. Margaret listened in silence, her emotions a complex mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of pity. She saw before her a broken man, a man consumed by his past, a man who had lost everything. I know I can't undo what I've done, Ashton said, his voice breaking. But I hope that by confessing, by telling the truth, I can find some measure of peace. Margaret looked at him, her gaze unwavering.
Peace? She said.
There is no peace for what you did. There is only justice. Ashton nodded, his eyes filled with tears.
I know, he said.
And I accept my punishment. Margaret stood up to leave. She had heard what she needed to hear. She had faced her demons, and she had found a measure of closure. As she was walking out of the room, Ashton called out to her. Mrs. Calloway, he said. There's one more thing. James, he knew.
He knew about me.
He knew about the conspiracy. He was about to expose us all. He was a brave man. A good man. Margaret turned back to him, her eyes filled with a flicker of surprise.
I know, she said.
I know he was. She left the prison, stepping out into the London rain, the city lights reflecting in the wet pavement. The reckoning had come, not just for Ashton, but for all of them. And under a different sky, half a world away from where her journey began, she was able to let some part of it, finally, find a resting point. Chapter 20. A love forged in fire, tempered by time. The encounter with Ashton, while emotionally draining, provided Margaret with a final, crucial piece of the puzzle. James had known. He had been aware of the full extent of the conspiracy, and he had been on the verge of exposing it all. He had been a greater hero than she had ever realized. Returning to New York, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had done all she could to bring the conspirators to justice, to honor James's memory, and to find her own peace. But she knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still lives to be touched, still a world to be healed. She continued her charitable work, her dedication and compassion inspiring those around her. She became a mentor to younger women, sharing her wisdom, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the power of good. She also decided to write her story, to document her experiences, to share the lessons she had learned. She spent months, years even, meticulously crafting her narrative, weaving together the threads of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. She titled her book The Uniform in the Attic, a tribute to the discovery that had set her on this extraordinary path. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers around the world. It was a story of wartime intrigue, of personal courage, and of the enduring power of love. Margaret received countless letters from readers, sharing their own stories, their own struggles, their own triumphs. She realized that her story was not just her own, it was a universal story, a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity, to find hope in the darkest of times. One day, As she was walking through Central Park, enjoying the crisp autumn air, she saw a familiar figure sitting on a park bench. It was Miller. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the bond between them remained strong. They greeted each other warmly, their shared history a silent language between them. "I read your book," Miller said. "It's remarkable. You captured it all so perfectly."
"Thank you," Margaret said.
It was cathartic, a way to finally put it all to rest. They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the children playing, the leaves falling, the world going on. "Do you ever regret it?" Miller asked. "Getting involved? Putting yourself in danger?" Margaret thought for a moment.
"No," she said.
"I don't. It was the right thing to do. It was what James would have wanted. And it gave my life meaning. It gave me a purpose." "You were very brave," Miller said. Margaret smiled. "I wasn't brave," she said. "I was just in love. Love gives you strength you never knew you had." They talked for hours, reminiscing about the past, sharing their hopes for the future. They talked about James, about Elise, about the war, about the conspiracy. They talked about life, about loss, about the enduring power of the human spirit. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. She had lived a full life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, with both triumph and tragedy. She had loved and lost, she had fought and won, she had learned and grown. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her meaning. She had honored James's memory, and she had forged her own path, a path of courage, compassion, and resilience. A love forged in fire, tempered by time. That was her life. That was her story. And it was a story that would continue, passed down through generations, a testament to the enduring power of love, the unwavering pursuit of justice, and the indomitable spirit of a woman who had dared to challenge the darkness and to embrace the light. Epilogue. The brownstone on the quiet New York street stood as it always had, a silent witness to the passage of time. Inside, the attic remained, filled with the dust of years and the whispers of memories. The old armchair, where the uniform had once lain, was empty now, but the presence of James Calloway and the extraordinary journey of Margaret, his beloved wife, lingered in the air. The uniform, carefully preserved, was now housed in a museum, a testament to a wartime conspiracy, a love story, and a woman's unwavering courage. The small, silver locket, a key to unlocking so many secrets, was displayed alongside it, a symbol of remembrance, of love, of a promise kept. Margaret lived a long and fulfilling life, her later years marked by a quiet grace and an enduring spirit. She continued her charitable work, touching countless lives with her kindness and compassion. She never forgot James, her love for him a constant flame that burned brightly in her heart. When she finally passed away, peacefully in her sleep, she was laid to rest beside James, their graves marked by a simple headstone, their names intertwined, their love story a timeless testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. But the story didn't end there. Margaret's book, The Uniform in the Attic, continued to inspire readers around the world, its message of hope, resilience, and justice resonating across generations. The lessons learned, the sacrifices made, the love that had endured, all lived on, a legacy that transcended the boundaries of time and space. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows lengthened, it was said that a faint scent of pipe tobacco could be detected in the attic of the old brownstone, a subtle reminder of the ghost of silk and wool, of the secrets it had held, and of the extraordinary woman who had dared to uncover them. The love, the betrayal, the courage, it all lingered, a story etched in time, a testament to a love that had conquered all.